Welcome, everyone. I'm Usra Ghazi, a Master of Theological Studies candidate here at Harvard Divinity School and a junior fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions, where we're gathered. Welcome to our panel on religion and social welfare, how faith-state partnerships can save the world. Last year, I had the privilege of working with the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships on a campus-level initiative called the President's Interfaith and Community Service Campus Challenge. This office partnered with the faith-based satellite offices at the Department of Education and the Corporation for National and Community Service to empower higher education institutions across the country to address community needs through collaboration across lines of faith and secular identity. This was my first experience working with state agencies who intentionally sought to engage with religious institutions like DePaul University, a Catholic campus, or the faith-based student organizations at public campuses like the College of William and Mary. I spent much of my first year here at Harvard studying the impact and efficacy of these types of public-private partnerships, and especially the role of organizations like Catholic Charities, Habitat for Humanity, and ICNA Relief, as they step up to address issues of homelessness, hunger, and disaster relief, for example, as religiously affiliated organizations. In some cases, these faith-based organizations are granted state funding for the services that they provide, and in other cases, they're not. I've invited our panelists to speak to us today about their faith-based social service efforts, their engagement or lack thereof with state agencies and public funds, as well as the way that the role of religion plays into their work. This event is the fourth in a series I'm organizing this year called Interfaith as Antidote, Models of Faith-Based Civic Engagement. If you're interested in learning about the final event in this series on the justice system, please see me. It's going to be on April 22nd, later this month, and I'll be around, so please do come speak to me about that if you'd like to attend. And the title of today's event is Intentionally Provocative. How can faith-state partnerships save the world? I personally think that the establishment of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships signifies increasing opportunities for religious communities to create positive change through government support and community engagement. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's explore this topic with our panelists. Today we are joined by Father Bryan Hehir. He's the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at Harvard Kennedy School. He's also the Secretary for Healthcare and Social Services in the Archdiocese of Boston. His research and writing focus on ethics and foreign policy and the role of religion in world politics and in American society. We are also joined by Malika McDonald, who is the director of ICNA Relief Boston, which is affiliated with the Islamic Circle of North America, one of the largest Muslim umbrella organizations across the country. We're also joined by Dan Bush. He's a development director at Habitat for Humanity of Greater Lowell. He's not only the interfaith liaison for his Habitat affiliate, but is also a member of the Habitat International team, which is helping to drive interfaith in Habitat, and is also recently a grant recipient of the Argosy Foundation, which has partnered with Habitat to drive interfaith relationships and impact in our country. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. We'll go down the line. First, we'll hear from Father Bryan Hehir. Each panelist will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll open up for a conversation.
So first, let me say, as always, it's a pleasure to come back to the Divinity School. Always a delight to do that. And I want to thank Usra for establishing this panel. When I was a graduate student here, I was marinated in Reinhold Niebuhr, who stressed the limits of what you're going to accomplish in the world. So can we save the world? I don't think I want to take that question on, but I'll go in another direction and use up my 7 minutes. I think the first question to look at is how you locate religiously based nonprofits. And my view is that they fit within the general category of nonprofits as nonprofits function here in the United States. One of the things about that in the United States is that if you look, particularly in the area of social policy, social service and otherwise, if you look at the United States in comparison to other advanced industrial democracies, market-based democracies. Basically, if you compare the U.S. to those 17 or so other advanced industrial democracies, what you find out in social policy is that the United States expects less from the state, more from the market, and a lot from nonprofits, because the nonprofits fit between what the state doesn't do and what the market cannot always guarantee, namely distributive justice. So nonprofits here in this society are, in a sense, rooted quite deeply in our background and both democratic polity and our view of social policy. We have a welfare state, but a limited welfare state. We tend to turn to the market. Think of what was called welfare reform in the 90s. The idea was put people into the market. Think of the healthcare debate. The idea is the market has to be central, even if it's a substantially led government program. So we fit within nonprofits. Faith-based nonprofits are a specification of that broader model. So faith-based nonprofits, for example, likely will have distinctive motives and imperatives that lead them to establish institutions to provide assistance in various ways. Now, the faith-based model provides, on the one hand, legitimation. It also provides, at times, limitation. That is to say, the religious community, in light of which the faith-based operates, gets legitimation from the religious community. It also may be told, we don't do certain things, and we must do other things. The third thing that comes up is how the relevant religious community or religious tradition thinks about its relationship to civil society and the state. So there are some faith-based institutions, for example, that will not take any government funds going to Usra, and that argument is not simply a pragmatic argument. It often is a religiously or theologically based argument. The Mennonite community, for example, is a good example of that. Very active, first-rate agency, but it is all funded, to my knowledge, entirely out of the Mennonite Church. So how they think of their relationship to state and society will very often determine their positions on questions of funding and on the roles they will play or won't play. It goes beyond funding. For example, I've advised on a basis for a number of years. Indeed, when I was here at the Divinity School teaching, I advised Catholic Relief Services, which is a very large relief and development agency in the United States. Now, Catholic Relief Services played a very large role in the Balkans after the wars in the Balkans. The structure in the Balkans after the war, the sort of post-jus bellum after the war, security was provided by NATO, and social service was provided by the UN, under the guise of the UN. So Catholic Relief Services was working within the context of the UN ministry and mission. But they were asked at times to consult with the military. Now, given our background, we did not find that difficult, although we did it within limits. I think the Mennonites would have found that impossible to do. Now, beyond locating the faith-based institution, there then are another series of questions that are important. What is the relationship of the faith-based agency to the religious community? Is it a very tightly knit linkage or a loose association? So, for example, in terms of healthcare in the Catholic community, I relate for the Cardinal to 3 Catholic healthcare systems. That relationship is very tight. Even though they are independent 501c3s, there is a code of conduct for Catholic hospitals, and there is rather detailed observance of the code that's expected. I have talked to people from mainline Protestant churches who have hospitals called Lutheran hospitals or Baptist hospitals. The linkage is much looser in terms of that. So how tightly you're tied to the religious community makes a difference. The degree of funding, just to give you some sense, when I served as president of the National Conference of Catholic Charities around the country, we have probably 160, 170 chapters around the country. The average federal state funding to those agencies is about 64% of their budget. So it is a large part. Catholic Charities here in Boston serves 200,000 people. It's got a $38 million budget. About 50% of that budget is primarily state, federal funds. Now again, that relates back to a whole understanding of church and state, the role of the church in the society. That is not necessarily true for all religious communities. Final thing I would say in terms of this question of limitation, if you look at the healthcare world and the social service world, the healthcare world is much more complicated in its relationship with the state and with the church, because you have both the dynamics of different ways of providing health care, different kinds of treatments that are part and parcel of standard treatment in American healthcare, and we have hospital restrictions that we don't participate in some of those. So it's much more complicated than the social service dimension, but maybe we can get into that. I've used up my 7. Okay, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be with you. I am Malika Rushdan, and I am the director of ICNA Relief Boston, the Boston Field Office, which is the Islamic Circle of North America. And I am also the national director of our transitional housing facilities, which we have 12 within the United States. And we'll be opening a lucky 13 here in Massachusetts, inshallah, God willing. I'm here to speak a little bit about what ICNA Relief does and how we do it, but also to learn from my colleagues here. Because the Muslim community is very new to the social services within the United States and really finding ourselves here. And funding has been difficult and has been an issue. But the need for social services came about as the Muslim community grew in the United States, and we started to see that there were various needs among individuals. But also, the faith is really what drives this movement within the Muslim community to serve. Actually, our motto and our logo is Muslims for Humanity and Service to Mankind. And really seeing that, how Islam, we have a saying that was based by our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that how can you go to sleep at night if your neighbor is hungry? So really feeling that, the need to serve those in our communities. I am astounded by the figures that the priest father shared with us, because ICNA Relief's funding is pretty much predominantly through individual donations from the community. Almost 98% of our funding is through individual donations, through fundraising and charitable giving, or zakat, which is one of the tenets of our faith. We have had some funding in really working and developing relationships. We've been to visit with the White House Initiative of faith-based initiatives, as well as developing relationships with different foundations. But I think it's harder for the Muslim community to really develop those relationships of trust with the funders. Especially, I think it's easier at the federal level than it has been at the state level, and the money that comes down from the federal government in building those relationships. Part of it is because of Islamophobia and where is that money going and how is it going to be spent. But then also, for example, ICNA Relief, we became incorporated in 2005. Though the Muslim community in Islamic Circle of North America is a 36-year-old organization, we first became incorporated in 2005. So we're still a young organization and still very young to the funders. But we've been very successful in expanding our field offices. We have 15 field offices currently in the United States, and we were very active during Hurricane Katrina, Gustav, Ike, and Hurricane Sandy. So we're very well known among FEMA and American Red Cross for our disaster relief efforts. We have been able to become through Catholic Charities. We were subcontracted after Hurricane Gustav and Ike, so still at the subcontracting stage and not being able to secure funding on our own. But we are working towards developing those relationships. So again, I've came more to learn, I think, than to share, but thank you.
So my name is Dan Bush. You heard already. Again, thank you very much to Usra for the invitation to come and talk, and to the Divinity School as well. And also to my co-panelists. It's really a tremendous opportunity to share what Habitat is about, and maybe dispel a few misconceptions as well. To come back to Father's point about the linkages, just to start real quick, as you think about Habitat, you might be familiar with a franchise model. Think of us as a franchise, if you would. We have a set of rules that we have to follow to be a member of, in good standing with Habitat International. They provide support services that helps the independent affiliates thrive. And just as the Quiznos guy down the street, if he stops putting avocados on the sandwich and stops toasting it, he's a great sandwich guy, but he's not a Quiznos. So in terms of Habitat, we have a whole list of items that we need to make sure that we adhere to, and one of them each year, all of our independent boards, and there are 18 of them here in Massachusetts, we all reaffirm that we're a Christian organization. And so that's something that is good to note as a start, okay? So again, I'm with the Habitat for Humanity of Greater Lowell. There are 18 affiliates, as I just mentioned, across the state. And it's important really for us to note in this conversation as well that Habitat doesn't seek to be the expert inside of Christianity, and is certainly not looking to be the Christian building expert. Really, that's something that really we work hard to dispel that notion. And so real quickly, for those of you that are not familiar with Habitat's model of how families become partners, there's a selection process where the families come in and they discover whether they would like to be a homeowner family, and then if they're selected based on their criteria of being in the 25 to 60% area median income. Imagine somebody living here in Cambridge on $35,000 or $40,000 a year. They're not doing too well. They're struggling poor. They would become a partner, and they would build with us. A couple will put in 400 to 450 hours of sweat equity, and the sweat equity really enables them to become the homeowner. And then, just as other homeowners, they have the privilege then of paying a mortgage for 25 or 30 years until their loan is paid off, and that mortgage payment goes into what is called the Fund for Humanity. And Fund for Humanity goes to pay more houses and more houses and more houses. And so that's just real quick thumbnail. As I said, the mortgage is 30% of their income, and that is something that really, if you look at what is appropriate, then one family may be at a different place than another one, but 30% is the absolute maximum that they would pay for their mortgage. So I got a little bit of help from Habitat International, because I'm really outclassed here on this table with some of the folks on the Divinity side, right? Okay, Father, you'll correct me if I'm wrong in a couple of these places. But the CEO of Habitat, Jonathan Beckford, it reminds us, a quote that he gave me was, an element of building community and finding solutions that has been part of Habitat's story from the beginning has been our ideal of reconciliation. From our roots at Canoina Farm, which is outside of Atlanta, where Christians sought to live in racial harmony, to some of our current projects that bring together Muslims, Christians, and Jews who seek an avenue for building peace. Habitat for Humanity has an opportunity to put aside differences and work together. Or as my friend down in New York City put it more succinctly, Christianity can be your center without being your border. So when building community, sector, habitat, societal impact, we will remain a Christian ministry in the community, but it doesn't have to define us. Right, so it means engaging the community in everything that we do, and everything that we try to serve the community. That we're not going out and proselytizing and trying to convert people to Christianity. We're trying to engage people in reconciliation of a problem that's in our town and so, or in our city. And so our age, like Christ's, was torn with animosities, right? So the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus he used that to address the animosity of his day, provides some support for our interfaith efforts, right? And that the Spirit was poured out in flesh. The theologian Amos Young explained that in speaking to an audience of Jews, Jesus' choice of hero of the story, a non-Jew, a person of a different faith, affirms that Jews could learn something from Samaritans, so Christians can learn something from other folks, right? So what can we learn? We are applying that faith in action is a worthy goal, and making sure that the community knows that people of all backgrounds and all stripes can participate in our endeavor. And by engaging and participating in a cooperative relationship with people of all roots, that the love of the neighbor that Jesus espoused and he reminds us of is something that we can participate in the world, and that we don't lose our identity by participating in that conversation with people, but that we can grow and we can share and we can have the entire community be participative in it. So again, as Jesus said, if they are not against us, then they are for us. So who would be against the idea of having a better community? And if you're going to accept the offer of a glass of water, then can't you accept the offer of build a better community? Can't you accept the offer from everyone? If it's graceful to accept a glass of water as Jesus did, then all people of all walks can participate in this project. And so to specifically address the question that was raised about how does government come into this and support Habitat's efforts, we're not a government organization. We fall in that wedge that was discussed. We're trying to improve a piece that the market can't address. So we receive a variety of government funding tools that some are obvious and some are not. And so far as we receive direct cash contributions from towns and cities that help us either to purchase land, or some towns have community and reinvestment money that's called CPA, community preservation or such, that we can access. But some of the biggest things that benefit nonprofits like us are laws that are written that demand that banks particularly are funding works in the community. And that has a multiplier effect insofar as Santander Bank or TD Bank or Eastern Bank or Enterprise Community Bank, who would become partners of ours. Well, the rest of the community is observing that and is their peers with those organizations. And so the presence of the Community Reinvestment Act actually drives behavior up and down the corporate ladder. To give you a sense of my own affiliate, all the affiliates, I said there are 18 of them, that have different pictures of diversity of fundraising. Government funding last year, out of our budget of $1.6 million, $30,000 cash. Not much. But when you look at the relationship that we have with the city that donated land to us and provides services to us, that when we write our reports to the EPA and get the funding through HUD, then they're providing the services for that. That doesn't look like a dollar contribution at the bottom of the spreadsheet, but sure enough it is. And again, it's driving behaviors, and so that linkage really is something which becomes really important. And so then the other part of it is, again, some of the really small investments that we receive from HUD. There's a program called Self-Help Ownership Program, and they contributed $15,000 to us for a piece of property last year that goes towards infrastructure costs. Well, the infrastructure costs on a total house build of about $200,000 is not that much, but the total investment return that they've received on that $15,000 is really quite tremendous. So, we're taking unused land in a city and turning it into productive tax increment for the town or the village. And so I think my time is probably up. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak with you.
Okay, thank you to the panelists, Father Hehir, Malika, and Dan, for your opening remarks. And let's open up to conversation. Would anyone like to pose a question or comment to our panelists? Yes, go ahead.
So you've talked a little bit about how you worked with Catholic charities, but I'm wondering to what extent nonprofits work with each other on a regular basis, or if that's somewhere that you grow to. Kind of funny.
There's
It's more for the recording than for just.
in the religious nonprofit sector, there's a lot of interreligious and ecumenical cooperation. It varies by region and city and things, but basically, very often, it is about advocacy. So several religious communities may well be supporting pieces of legislation in the state legislature or in the Congress. When I worked at the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, we worked with national organizations all the time dealing with Congress. And it is both strictly ecumenical in the sense of among Christian communities, and it is interreligious, engaging Jewish, Muslim, and also engaging a lot of collaboration with secular nonprofits and not only nonprofits. I mean, when you're trying to get a piece of legislation through the Congress, you want to gather all the friends you can around you and make sure they make all the phone calls they can make. So I've spent my life spending a lot of time in those kind of conversations.
I know ICNA Relief on a national level, we do a lot of interfaith work with disaster relief and disaster first responders. So working with Catholic charities, Lutheran Family Services, who actually was our funder during Texas, during Hurricane Ike, I think was in Texas. And then also here locally, we're part of the GBIO, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, so working with them. And even through my center, I've had volunteers from all faiths. I've worked very closely with the Vineyard Church in Cambridge, with volunteers coming from there working with Iraqi refugees. So if and when possible, we're always open and willing to work with.
Our affiliate is a member of the Greater Lowell Interfaith Leadership Alliance. There's one instance where we have a broad participation with other faith organizations in the community, but also the nonprofit community, I think, is a very generous one insofar as many ways that where conversations are traded of capacity building conversation, even while we were just sitting up here just kind of talking about things that we might do together, or how did you unwrap that problem. Just some of those informal networks are incredible, but they're also, as Father just mentioned, the lobbying that goes on in Washington, regular participative events that draws other organizations into. And again, we've got a brand name that other people haven't had an opportunity to build yet, which allows Habitat to kind of drive the conversation and pull other people along that will also benefit.
So I'll pose a question to our panelists. As we heard, each of your organizations is rooted in a distinct faith identity. And I'm wondering how this identity materializes in the, how it looks in the social services that you provide. So the ways that you engage with volunteers, recipients of your services, or members, how does the faith or religious aspect impact the services that are offered? I know that some of the opposition to the federal level faith-based initiatives and federal funding directed to religious organizations that offer services, some of that opposition is based on the argument that, well, a faith identity or a faith-based mission doesn't necessarily improve the kinds of services that are offered. So I'm wondering how you might respond to that and how we would see that faith or religious aspect that's rooted in your missions in the ways that you engage with folks that services are provided to, volunteers, members.
Well, there has been a debate for a long time about whether you can empirically verify that there is an add-on, if you will, from a faith-based perspective. My sense of the literature is that it is it's a Scotch verdict, and the Scotch verdict is not proven, okay? So you find indications. Now, particularly in the 1990s, there was a fair amount of argument that problems that are particularly visible in so-called post-industrial societies, a phrase that one of our neighbors here invented, Dan Bell, when he was a social scientist, that there were particular problems like addiction, for example, poverty within urban areas, that the religiously based community may have a comparative advantage. And there were some indications that that could be so, but I don't think there's any definitive argument at all. I think it really, the better way to think about it is hopefully the religious traditions from which we come are committed to a kind of standard of excellence, and we try to communicate that. But a definitive argument that we've got a comparative advantage on this problem or that problem, I think is a fairly unproductive road to go down, in my own experience.
I think from my work, how the faith plays out, how you would see the faith is just clearly based on my clothing. It's very clear that I'm a Muslim when I go out into the community to serve. But I think it's the faith aspect is really among the workers within the organization and what drives us and motivates us. But I think working within the community, other than if you were working with myself or some of my male colleagues, you wouldn't even know if we were a Muslim organization or just another nonprofit social service organization. But I think it's the religious aspect and the teachings is really what we practice, and within our staff meetings or different trainings to give us spiritual strength to continue in the work. But other than that, I don't think that we operate any different than any other nonprofit.
So in this question, there's a public face and a private face too, insofar as when Habitat boards are collected and board meetings are going on, they are almost invariably started with a prayer. But on the build site, that's not the case. And since we are a social agency and developer and a bank, there are a number of rules that we are applying to ourselves because that's good banking practice. We're going to lose our ability to be a banker if we discriminate in the community. And so we do not discriminate in any aspect, whether we are talking about families who are trying to become partners with us and essentially become a loan customer of ours. And that goes all the way down through the marketing and whatnot to determine who might become a family. And so we have a very diverse number of families where in our community that we're serving, but we also have a very diverse volunteer base that we're serving as well. And that is something in which we are very proud of in both instances, because we really are reflecting the community that is in front of us. And I think that we would be a much weaker organization if we applied a different rubric to it.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much for your presentation and for all that you do. The question I have really relates to the relationship between the faith-based communities and federal government or federal funding. I heard three very different models of that. I mean, a relatively high proportion of federal funding comes to Catholic relief organizations. A very small amount goes to the organizations that you spoke about. And in your case, Dan, I think it really came down to local land grants and so on that were more important than federal funding. So the question I have is that is there any kind of ideal level of federal funding that it would be worth these faith-based initiatives to campaign for, or to mobilize behind, or to try and increase the national pot of that? Or do you think it's really better, or is it just so variegated that it's better to leave it that way and allow people to do things in very different ways? And even is it better for most of the funding to come through voluntary giving because that, you know, has a certain kind of commitment and energizes people. So it's really the whole funding dimension and the relationship to federal dollar funding, and whether you think there's any, I mean, do we need to mobilize more of that in this country, or is it operating at a good level that ought to be left alone? I mean, those are the kind of questions that are going through my mind.
Yes, sir.
This is a constantly debated topic, both within the religious nonprofits and in the wider society. Within the religious nonprofits, there often is an argument that if you that the cost benefit to the organization is not good if you're highly dependent on government funding, because that can be can exercise an inordinate influence, it's argued, and therefore it's a problem. Secondly, there always is the problem that this federal or state money is given for specific purposes and programs. If the legislature calls the program off next year, you've got a problem in terms of long-range, middle-range planning for budget. So there is that problem. I personally feel, on the first point, I feel if an agency has a strong sense of identity, it can manage the government funding. I mean, you go in and bargain. That's just my own sense. But the second question is very real. That is to say, for example, we do child care grants. Well, those are based on vouchers, and that number can go up and down very, very rapidly. So it's very hard to get a 5-year plan based on that kind of engagement. And in some other states where they have a less socially conscious budget, it's even more difficult. So I think those two things are in the wider community. You also do get arguments in the wider community, beyond the nonprofits, that government funding ought not to go to religious communities. Now, constitutionally in this country, there is a decisive constitutional divide between funding for education and funding for social service and health care. Social service and health care, the funding is in the billions of dollars, but obviously there has been a long tradition of Supreme Court decisions arguing that funding should not go to religiously based schools on a K through 12 basis, higher education. But that's been a fundamental shift, quite different from Canada, quite different from the UK as far as I know it.
The tough question that is related to your question is funding for the folks that fall into the gap, and you hear to refer to it all the time as the safety net. Right now, again, I already mentioned to the fact that Habitat for Humanity has tremendous brand awareness, which brings money and support to Habitat at the cost of other nonprofits, because you're competing for a limited number of grant dollars. And there's not been an easy answer to how do you fund the project or address the problem financially that isn't got such a sexy appeal or doesn't have such a good brand management team on it. And that's a real problem for folks who are in social services, because where does the money come from? And the money that is being provided by the government programs is very scant and always at risk, as I already mentioned our SHOP grant is.
Yes. I think my question is kind of related to David, which is that in all of your talks, I heard it's sort of that area where maybe you might want to or need to step into advocacy for maybe advocating for like in Dan's case in the for these policies where banks do have to do certain things, or for maybe something to counter Islamophobia in your case, or in the case of maybe healthcare issues, Catholic charities or other. So when and how is it dicey? Do you do those kinds of things? I think it's. I know some examples myself, but I'd love to hear from people on the ground, maybe even personal experiences when you have stepped in.
All right ahead.
Well, On the national level, ICNA, which is the parent organization of ICNA Relief, we're under their umbrella, the Islamic Circle of North America, they do have a social justice committee, which is doing the advocacy work around, advocacy and education around Islamophobia. The lobbying and so forth and so on, we're very new to that, so I'd be very interested to hear how they.
Well, first of it, partly, I suspect you know this inside out, partly it's regulated by law.
Right.
So 501c3 is not supposed to spend above a certain ill-defined percentage of its activity on lobbying, and it's a percentage of your total budget. So when I worked for the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, we're talking about an agency that has 200 to 300 employees, pursues in the Congress probably 100 to 175 programs and bills during a year. So it is, you take your total budget, and there is an estimation, I forget, it's like 10% or so. You're not supposed to exceed 10% of your total budget in terms of activity regarding lobbying. The state is stricter than the federal government. Even the language of, you have to be careful about your language. You can work up on the hill, but you have to be careful about what you say you're doing. But at the federal level, it's governed at that level by law in the first instance. The other thing you have to be careful about is not endorsing candidates. You can deal with issues, you can deal with legislation, but endorsing candidates, you can lose your tax exemption. So that's a whole different ballgame. In terms of choosing how the agency decides what it will advocate for, I think that in my experience, that begins within the normative tradition itself. In other words, what does the normative tradition of the religious community move you to support or move you to oppose? And that is the dominant factor. First of all, you figure that out, then you decide really on I think on a cost-benefit basis. You've only got so much time and effort. You've only got so much reputation that you can use. So you decide where's the comparative advantage to go in. I mean, and to some degree, legislators associate different religious traditions with different areas and different issues. Now, sometimes it's good to surprise them and support something they don't expect you to support. Just to see if they're awake. The idea is to fool them. But I mean, they say, "Oh my God, here comes the Catholics."
We know what they're going to.
So I mean, there's a legal part of this, there's a prudential part, there's a normative part that goes into the development of your legislative strategy.
Can you imagine if they're saying, "Here comes the Muslims"?
So just a little, again, detail on the boots on the ground insofar as, again, Habitat has got a robust advocacy effort that's going on in Washington, D.C., and individually the affiliates operate with the local municipalities and with the state government as well. Most of our effort is really at the grassroots, and so we're really working to make our issues known to the public. And so again, when you look at Habitat, when you look on the ladder of what is being provided, we're really not going after true homeless individuals. It's not part of Habitat's mission of people that we can help. We've got to make it, that's an issue that somebody else has got to help. It doesn't mean that we won't talk about it, because it is something that we're involved in, but that's not one of Habitat's core issues. Similarly, we talk about property rights, and we push hard at the UN for women's property rights, right? But at the local level, that in the United States especially, is really not an issue. So we have to pick and choose our battles, just like everybody else. The funding is not yes.
I have a question for Father Bryan. Father Bryan, I'm a Catholic, born and raised in the tradition, and I remember a statistic that shocked me, and as a Catholic I didn't realize it. It said it was 25 or 30% of all the health care that that happens in the United States goes through a Catholic facility in some way. So my question is, does the White House Base Initiatives Office, will it interfere with that? Because I think that, you know, the medical system in America is good, and you guys are responsible for 30% of it. Does the White House Base Initiatives affect your way of doing business? And the second part of the question is, with Obamacare, do you see in the next 10 years the Catholics will be having more beds or less?
My understanding is not the quite same numbers that you had.
Right, I'm not-
I mean,
It's-
I know a lot of nuns that would be very happy if they were doing 30% of their health care.
I think it was 20% of the beds.
I think the number that's often used is we are responsible for about 15% of acute care admissions to hospitals throughout the United States. Catholic systems are. Now, in addition to that, though, and actually a larger sector than acute care hospitals is nursing homes, and so that may bring you up close into the high 20s or 20 to 25%. That's probably true.
Okay.
Secondly, it isn't really regulated by the White House Office of Faith-Based Initiative. They're interested in what our healthcare is like, but this is really dealing with the government, and healthcare is dealing with Medicare and Medicaid, or has been up till now. In terms of Obamacare, once again, we'd be affected the same way the healthcare industry as a whole is going to be affected. There clearly is a push to a more regulated industry. There's a push to capitation, where, in other words, rather than you go in and see the doctor and there is a price that you pay, the doctor or the hospital is given a budget, and within that budget, he or she have to provide health care. So that is going to, that's going to be a more stringent effort, because the thrust of the healthcare reform is to reduce costs. I mean, it's cost, coverage, and quality are the three dominant normative goals. So what we have found, if you look at Catholic healthcare, this is 2015. I just did a review day with about 15 to 17 Catholic hospital systems, and from around the country. And if you look at what's happened over the last, well, let's just say from the mid-1950s until today, to use a round number. In the mid-1950s, all of our hospitals were basically freestanding hospitals. So Mercy Hospital in Cincinnati and Mercy Hospital in Cleveland were both staffed by the Sisters of Mercy, but they were independent entities. So in the 1980s, the first phase of consolidation, when that happened, then the religious communities consolidated. So they created the Daughters of Charity healthcare system around the country. The Mercy Sisters healthcare system, either around the country or second. Then as the pressure intensified on cost and organization, what happened in Catholic healthcare system was we developed systems of various religious communities. So, for example, Ascension Healthcare, they're a $15 billion operation based in St. Louis, present in multiple states. They have a series of religious communities. I believe they have a series. I know Catholic Health Initiative in Denver has probably 12 or 15 religious communities who had already brought their hospitals into a system. Now they're into a mega system, and that's where you get leverage in the market. So my guess is we'll function okay. The one thing about healthcare that's different than social service, I have 6 social service agencies that report through me to the Cardinal. If you're in Catholic Charities or you're in St. Mary's Home, you can make a mistake, a financial mistake, a misjudgment, what to invest in, and you'll survive. You make a huge mistake in healthcare, and you are very close to the margin. I mean, it's a highly, highly competitive business. and you just have to be on track all the time.
Thanks.
Yes.
I have a question with regard to the Muslim community because and I'm thinking specifically of things like the Holy Land Foundation, a faith-based organization that was designed to provide services to a population that apparently the United States didn't think it was worthy of. And the leaders of that organization not only didn't get funding, they got thrown in jail. And then I remember that during the Iraq War, I don't think this was faith-based or anything like that, but people who sent teddy bears to Iraq, I mean, that's pretty non-lethal, were threatened with jail. I mean, things like food, medicine, toys even. This was specifically to Iraq. I don't know I think they were just sending food and probably medicine to Palestine, but apparently these people aren't worthy of it, and yet they were starving and dying. They seem about as worthy as any other population. So I don't understand why the United States assists some populations and imprisons other populations, other people who are trying to do the same kind of work. Targets them.
Comments from the panel?
Well, I think she just summarized everything that I said much better than I did.
Oh.
It's very difficult as a Muslim organization or a Muslim faith-based organization to operate in the United States as a nonprofit. ICNA Relief USA decided in 2005 when we became incorporated to only do domestic social services, disaster relief. So we only operate within the United States.
Oh, okay.
And we actually do not take money from overseas or send money overseas.
Okay.
Really, and then all of our financial documents and everything, just as any other organizations, getting our audits and our 990s?
990s, yeah.
990s. Everything, all of our financial records are up on our website. We've actually gotten a gold star as being from Guide Stars for our transparency of our financial documents. But it is difficult, and it is difficult with situations such as the Holy Land Foundation after September 11th being shut down, their CEO and founder is going to jail and imprisoned, and other organizations. ICNA Relief, fortunately, was one of the organizations who kind of made it through that period after being scrutinized and under the microscope for so long. But we are one of the only Muslim organizations that work solely in the United States. So I think that has worked to our benefit. And I guess somewhat to our benefit is being that 98% of our budget is from individual donations. So we're not depending on funding trends through the government or different foundations.
Right, okay. Well, my question also, because Catholics are allowed, like Father Hehir said that they worked in Bosnia. Believe me, I think that we should be working in other areas, but other religious and nonprofit organizations are allowed to operate internationally.
We
And
have
that's
an
why-
international branch. We're under the Islamic Circle of North America, so ICNA Relief USA does our domestic relief work,
Uh-huh.
and then we have Helping Hand for Relief and Development, which does our international relief work.
Oh, okay.
There are separate organizations, separate 501c3, but they do international relief work.
Okay, great.
So we had a question in the back.
Yeah, this is an interesting opportunity to ask people with I'm not involved in this kind of work, and I get to critique texts all day, so it's nice to see and actually have people to talk to about it. So my question is about this, the prejudice in particularly against Islamic organizations. And I wonder what the responsibility is of other organizations to reach out and support that, because even though all these organizations are a part of the 501c3 broad nonprofit group, there's some sort of solidarity in that, and unfortunately there are government agencies and a population in the United States at least that views religious organizations, no matter what faith tradition, in the same light. So I wonder if there's a responsibility for brand name nonprofits to speak out and support other groups, and also for groups that are underfunded and don't have that brand name, maybe to be okay with, to use your word, subcontracting? And is there a balance that is being reached or that certain organizations are working for? Or is that something that's hard to talk about because there are so few dollars out there? And it kind of assumes that all of your missions are the same, which in fact they're not. And I think that that's important that they're not the same and important that they're from different backgrounds. But considering the prejudice that the government shows specifically towards Islamic organizations and other organizations, I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas about what the next steps might be and how people can engage.
I just wanted to add on to that question. I had a similar question in line of thought when I heard, I think, Malika, you were mentioning that ICNA Relief had been subcontracted by Catholic Charities. And so could you also speak to these types of partnerships that we don't often hear of? Where is that kind of collaboration happening?
Well, the collaboration that we've done with funding has been on the national level for our disaster relief services. We haven't really done collaboration. We also offer, we have 15 food pantries, which actually, they're halal food pantries for the Muslim dietary guidelines. We haven't been able to work with other faith-based traditions in that aspect, but we have received funding from like the USDA. We have received smaller grants from non-profits such as Feeding America, so forth and so on, but really with the faith-based initiatives, it's really just been with Catholic Charities, Lutheran Family Services, really related to our disaster relief and disaster response, where we have a trained first responder team. So, but I think it's just really more towards building those relationships and having conversations like these.
Yeah, a lot of this has to do with history.
Yeah,
I mean,
of
in other words, I mean, it takes time to build. It takes time to build a record. It takes time to build relationships. Catholics in Boston in the mid-18th century, the sign in the window said, "Jobs available, Catholics need not apply." So, I mean, that it just happens under those kinds of things.
I'm a McDonald, I understand.
And in terms of international affairs, the German community during World War I had a very difficult situation. The Japanese had it very difficult. So some of this is history. Now this is institutional history. That is to say, you've got government agencies that have worked with identifiable organizations for years. And so that doesn't mean you get every grant you apply for. It does mean that you approach. The subcontracting is interesting because, for example, for Catholic Relief Services, which is probably the third largest relief and development agency in the country, we get approached about doing subcontracting in Africa because there are a lot of Catholic healthcare systems in Africa. But we have strict limitations on what we can provide in a medical setting from the church side. And so, for example, abortion-related services, which can fit into a population program, we get asked to be the subcontracting agent, and we always have to turn it down because we just can't do that. So that's a subcontracting relationship that we could do a lot more of, but not within, as I say, within the limits of our own tradition. I think generally in the nonprofit community, there is a lot of attempts to stand up for each other, but it, you know, as with everything else, it's how much time you've got to do that. That's real.
Also to add to though, I think with the Muslim community, again, as I said, ICNA Relief is really the only national Muslim faith-based organization working solely in the United States. And the Muslim community, we still have a long ways to go building amongst ourselves. And I think that we failed in some ways to develop those relationships and reaching out to others too. Especially those who are from the immigrant communities, really afraid to go outside of their community and build those relationships because of the events of September 11th and here in Boston, the Boston Marathon bombing. So we still have a ways to go of working within our own communities, doing intra-faith amongst the various cultures within our community, and then developing the relationships outside of the community. But I find it with myself, I do a lot of work. I'm attending meetings with the Human Trafficking Roundtable that the Department of Homeland Security has, working on the Drug and Prostitution Task Force in the Grove Hall section of Boston. And when I go, people are more than welcome. I'm more than welcome there, but people are also surprised to see me at the table. So I think the Muslim community still needs to come out of their own community and develop those relationships and get more involved.
Habitat has a very diverse opportunity that we seize on a regular basis, insofar as we not only have the disaster relief efforts that we partner up with other people, but the nature of our business is such that any group of any stripe can come and participate with what we're doing, and we share that opportunity on a regular basis. And there's not a person that I don't talk to on any given day that couldn't become a partner with Habitat to help to improve the community. And so that conversation goes so many different directions as to who can sponsor a house or a family or on down the road. And so we're truly community builders, and that's one of the things that's really one of the shine at most proud moments is when Habitat is able to facilitate a conversation like that.
Well, and coincidentally, in New York City and Brooklyn, when I was living there and working for ICNA Relief in New York, I brought a group of Muslim young women, and we participated in a community build in Brooklyn with Habitat for Humanity.
And happily, that's not unique.
Did you say you had a... Yeah? Go ahead.
How do you think your work in your communities would help build a stronger community if you were to come together and share your ideas with each other?
So she asked, how would your work in your communities be better if you worked together across your different organizations? Is that right? Yeah.
Well, I think to begin that all the communities, we all have, even though the funding at the federal level and government funding is limited, we all have resources within our community, and I think that we all have something to share and bring to the table and working together. But it's also developing those relationships, I think, which the transformational relationships are very powerful when working together in the community.
And generally speaking, it will always help. Different parts of the country, different religious groups are stronger in different areas. So you've got to look for what your lead agency is and then try and build around it. That's a theme that we can.
Perfect, yes. Go ahead.
I have a question about White House interfaith, faith-based organizing initiative. I remember back during the George W. Bush administration, there was an initiative, and there was a book by a man, I think his name was David Chu, who worked with some people together with John Ashcroft, evangelicals within the Bush administration. And it didn't come to much. So my question is, under the Obama initiative, if this question is directed, let me just ask it outright. What is number one on the list for discussion in Obama's faith-based initiative that would help us all work together and help save the world? What's number one on that list that they are pushing for, that's needed, that they can give some help in making some progress?
Well, just to go back to your first point, I think you referred to, John Ashcroft and others, it was an initiative called Charitable Choice, and it was passed as part of the welfare reform legislation in the 1990s. Now, Charitable Choice was an interesting product. The two dominant groups of people who were able to benefit from Charitable Choice, or to put it another way, the two dominant group of people that needed some help in a given area. And Charitable Choice was designed to help them along with others. Interesting enough, were large evangelical churches and small African American churches, because neither of them, in a sense, had ever been involved in taking government funds.
Right.
And therefore, the charitable choice initiative was meant to open the door to them. The evangelicals felt that the government was too intrusive into their records if they were going to take money. So there was a design to make that somewhat more open. The African American churches could not afford the kind of accounting and bookkeeping systems you needed to have to account to the
With the
government.
overhead.
And so in both counts, charitable choice was designed to help. I don't know that you can identify one initiative. The organizations are too diverse, and it's very hard to change programmatic organizations. If you've been doing something for 30, 40, 50 years, somebody says, drop that and pick up this. Very hard to do. You lay people off, you change your budget, you change everything. Sometimes you do it on your own, but I do think that it'd be hard to identify one thing. Children, families, poverty, inequality, housing, those, everybody would identify them as urgent, I think.
That's a great.
That's right.
Thank you.
Great, so at this time, let's just have some final comments from the panelists, and we'll open it up for everyone to have some conversation amongst ourselves, and there's some refreshments in the back of the room that I encourage everyone to partake in. So let's maybe start with Dan and then work our way down the table.
So I'll wrap up my comments with coming back to the young lady's question, really, is again, how do we drive this conversation continually upward? Habitat's role in it has been small, right, in the grand scheme of things, but it's been tremendously accomplished as well. 800 homes in Massachusetts alone is not a small achievement. But our communities continue to suffer greatly, and there are a number of people that, as I mentioned earlier, that are not going to come out on the winning pile, and we as a community need to help join together to address that. I very much again appreciate the opportunity to come today and participate. Thank you, Usra.
Well, at least as with ICNA Relief in Massachusetts, I am one of 2 staff people. So, but I think we're really growing in Massachusetts. We have a wonderful wealth of volunteers that are active with the organization, which help with the food pantry and our community service projects and building our transitional home here and other services. But I think, again, to answer my granddaughter's question, she's not in the room now, but you can tell she goes to a lot of these with me. Really, what we're trying to do here in Massachusetts at least, and maybe not as the organization may be doing in some of the other field offices, is really trying to develop relationships with faith partners and interfaith partners and with the broader community, and really serving those that are in need in the community and joining hands with others. The majority of our clients are non-Muslim. Many of the recipients of our community services are non-Muslim. So joining with others to be able to serve all of those that are in need. And it's a tremendous experience when I go to do, whether it's a back to school giveaway or feeding at Haley's house at the soup kitchen, when I walk in as a Muslim, just to see the looks on people's faces are like, we didn't even know you cared. So right there is reward enough. So we're able to do more of that and joining with others to serve all of humanity.
I think any nonprofit in social service today, any religious nonprofit, has to keep in mind that we are still coming out of that 2007, 2008 financial crisis and then the Great Recession. And in all of our agencies, there was an exponential increase in human need. The numbers I always use because they're just concrete. We run a series of food pantries all over the Archdiocese. One pantry over in Columbia Road at the Catholic Charities building. Before 2007, we would give out 5,000 pounds of food a month. We are now giving out 45,000 pounds of food a month. And the pattern hasn't changed over the last couple of years. Now that's just a cameo, that's just a snapshot of what's out there. But it is a long-term problem that is above above and beyond what our normal constituency is. Because the people who work the food pantries will tell you that among the people coming for help now are people who used to be our donors. So in addition to the traditional category that you always were set up to serve, there is a new category of new vulnerability among the working poor. And that kind of reality needs to be kept in mind by any of us and all of us.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for speaking.